To open the Postflop tool, log in up in the upper right hand corner. Log in here. And if it opens to an area other than the Postflop tool already, come up here to the ranges drop down and select Postflop. And what it has open to is a default screen. You can see that it's early position, 30 big blinds, raise first in. I'm going to select something different. One nice feature of this preflop section of the Postflop tool is you can pick one of the seat positions and use these left and right arrows to scroll through the seat positions and quickly see how the seat position changes the range. Now, for example, I've hit the right arrow and now I'm on the big blind. You can't raise first in of the big blind. Small blind, preflop action is folded to the small blind. Button, cut off, and so on. And this way you can study how the ranges are affected based on seat position. We can use the drop downs in the active seat to change the effective stack size and the seat position that we want to test on, to train on. So if I, for example, hit the drop down next to the effective stack size, I have the effective stack sizes that are supported by the Postflop tool. I'm going to go ahead and select 60 big blinds, and in the drop down next to the seat position, I'm going to go ahead and select middle position. And here we have our pre-flop opening range in middle position from 60 big blinds. So now I can go to one of these other seat positions, and let's say I'm going to select MP2 call. I get a pop-up that says, sorry, no flops for the spot. You can request that we solve it for you. And that's just exactly what it means. Range Trainer Pro will accept an email from you to request that they solve this particular kind of spot for you. Right now, it is not available. They do not have a database solved for this specific scenario yet. They will eventually, but they have just not done it yet. It's going to take months for the Range Trainer Pro administrators to use their solvers to solve every type of database. Solving takes time, even with good computer resources. They wanted to get this product out to us in a workable fashion, and they are loading solves 24/7 as we speak. So we will eventually get what we want, but you can request that they solve it for you. So I'm going to hit the OK button to close this box, and the MP2 goes back to none or fold. Okay. I've elected to go with, say, we're in middle position with 80 big blind effective stacks, and you note that we have the raise button here at 19% highlighted. We have 4 buttons here. These are all controls. Raise is highlighted because of the type of situation that we're in. It says we fold 81% of the time. We never call. We raise 19% of the time, and we never jam. Let's go ahead and hit the raise button, see what happens. And we bring up a box that tells us to select the villain seat and action. They have a lot of situations solved for opening against the big blind. So let's say the villain seat is in the big blind and the villain action is to call. So let's go ahead and select that. And now it takes us to the flop finder. We're going to talk about the flop finder a little later, but in this screen, we will select the type of flop that we want to study. I'm going to go ahead and close the flop finder for now by scrolling all the way to the bottom and hitting the cancel button. Now we were back at the beginning. You'll note that we don't have a range in here in our hand chart anymore. We can get that range back by just refreshing the browser. Give it a second. And there it is. It's back to early position default, 30 big blinds. So in this early stage, when they are still busily adding more flops, more databases to Range Trainer Pro, a good way to look at the situations that you can study at this point is to hit the database button right here. The database button takes us to this database selection screen. So let's say we want to study ace-high flops. I've pressed the ace. Now when I scroll through, there's quite a few less. It's only the ones that are ace-high. Now let's click the 9. You can see how much is filtered now. We can get them all on one screen. We can filter it even further. If we hit the Show Filters button, it brings up some choices. With these filters, I can further filter my flops. Like say I want ace-9 high flops that are two-tone. It does that. It unselects any and selects two-tone. I can do that with monotone and rainbow. If I want more flops than this, if I want to look at all my ace-high rainbow flops, I can just click the 9 again. Gets rid of the 9, and now we have all of our ace-high rainbow flops. Now if I go back to any, I'm back to having all of my ace-high flops. If I then go under flop card rankings and hit ace, and it'll replace any with ace, it will not have changed anything. I still have ace-high flops. But if I want all high cards and not just aces, I can deselect ace. See, right now I still have just ace-high flops because I have that selected. I can go to high card flops, and now it adds everything down to jacks, kings, queens, and some 10 high flops as well. Now, for my middle card, I click the mid radio button, and you can see how I've got all high card, then middle card flops. I go back to ace, just get high and middle card ace-high flops. Let's go with rainbow. And now I've got a reasonable amount to select from. If I wanted to further filter it, I can go by board texture with these check boxes. You can have more than one checkbox checked at a time. So if I go to paired flops right here, what I have is ace mid flops, rainbow, paired. I'm down to 4 left. You can uncheck that. Let's pick the ace 7-2 rainbow flop right here. You'll note that there's a fair use delay. This fair use delay is important. Let me talk about that for a second here. The fair use delay was designed by Range Trainer Pro to prevent people from using this application while playing online and using real-time assistance. This could be used for real-time assistance except for that fair use delay. They feel that the length of time of the fair use delay makes it impractical to use for online play. Not only that, but Range Trainer Pro has stated that if one of the online poker sites is investigating a potential RTA violation in their terms of service, they will cooperate with that poker site. There is a way to get around the fair use delay, but it also makes it impractical to use on a poker site while playing. I'll show you that later. When we first select a flop, we see that the action is on the position of the player that's earliest in the hand that we've selected. In this case, the action is on the big blind. And you can see that this was the big blind's calling range against the middle position open with this situation, 80 big blinds. If you're curious about this range, you can actually open another instance of the Range Trainer Pro and go into the Preflop tool. And I've already done that here. And you can see that this is the big blinds calling range against the middle position open. All of the yellow here, including the ones that are mixed that are mixed strategies. So that way you can compare. So you see how there was a calling range for King Queen suited and King Jack suited here, but not for Queen Jack suited and Queens. If we go back to the Postflop tool, you can see that Queen Jack suited and Queens are blank here, but everything that even had a partial strategy, a mixed strategy, is in the range here. I'm going to go through this tool and look at some of the controls that we can use. Square size proportional is a pretty important tool. When you check that checkbox, you will see how often that this hand should have gotten this far. So for example, Queen 4 suited should have gotten here 100% of the time, but Ace Queen suited should have rarely gotten here. And you've got some that are very thin, singularities, like Ace 3 offsuit. It's really not something to spend brain power memorizing because you're hardly ever going to see this situation. Remember, when we were pre-flop, we were really kind of ignoring singularities. Well, this is another way that singularities show up in Range Trainer Pro. So I'm going to go ahead and unclick square size proportional for now. And we can see that here's our flop. Here's the hand that we originally started with, which was middle position. But the highlight is around the big blind. And you can see the two cards there face down. The other positions don't have cards. And this is where the dealer button is. So the big blind is highlighted. This is the big blind's action. What we have down here are his choices of action. We can see that checking is practically 100% of the time. Betting 20% of the pot, donking is hardly ever. And betting 67% of the pot, donking is even less. So for all intents and purposes, as you can see here by this big sea of yellow, that he's got, for all intents and purposes, a 100% checking range. We've got some other indicators on this screen. You can see that early position folded, middle position raised, MP2, and all the other seats folded. Right, then the big blind called. Now we see a flop. The flop is ace of spades, seven of hearts, two of diamonds. And we can see this indication here says the action is on the big blind. It gives us the pot size here. And this is a node box that we don't have any control in. This is just like a placeholder for now. We got our database button if we want to start another flop. And we've got this long yellow bar down here. What this is telling us is that all we're ever doing is checking. It's basically gives us proportions, which will be color coded the same way as the buttons above it. This X here is for when we want to close this flop. This save icon here is a placeholder right now. It's not in use in the current version of the software. We've got a couple of tabs up here, one for equity and one for EV that haven't been selected yet. Right now we can see the strategy tab is selected. Let's go ahead and select the equity tab and see what happens. Okay, first of all, we have a couple of new radio buttons, the in position and the out of position radio buttons, with the out of position radio button pre-selected because the action is on the big blind, but you can select in position. So I'm going to start with out of position. What we have here are the actual equities of each hand combination that the big blind can have. they're color coded so that the ones with the most equity are the deepest green. Like for example, this uh, set of deuces down here is got 92.7% equity, and the deepest red are where we have it the worst. Like the 6-5 offsuit, we only have 14.8% equity. These equities are the pure equities like you would get in a tool like Flopzilla or Equilab. They are not accounting for equity realization. We can see that the big blind has his best equity, of course, on the hands that he connects with the flop most strongly. The pair of sevens being the best because at 94.9% is because he's got second set. He can't have top set because aces are not in his range from pre-flop. His two pairs are dark green, and as the green gets lighter, the equity gets less. When you get these neutral colors, like let's have a look at this jacks here. I'm mousing over, and jacks have 52.8% equity. Now I can click on that equity, and I get a hand breakdown down here, and we can see that his combinations of jacks have all got just about the same equity, but each individual hand will have slightly different, and in some situations, like say flush draws and things, there'll be a lot of equity difference between different combinations of the same basic combo. And if I go with one that's slightly darker, say the King 10 suited, we've got we've got average equity at 29.8% on King 10 suiteds. The different combos of King 10 suited have different equities, with the King of clubs, 10 of clubs being the worst because it doesn't even have a backdoor draw. If I click expected value, you can see that just about all of his hands have low expected values. Only the hands that connect most strongly with the flop have good expected values. Like at the pair of sevens, he's got 344.95 for an expected value, 345 on a pot size of 100. Now, unlike equity, the expected value does account for equity realization in this app. So in most cases, the out of position player will have lower expected values than the in position player because of equity realization. Now, some hands have uh, greater than 100% equity realization, even for the out of position player, like pocket aces have a lot of equity realization, greater than their actual equity because it's just the nature of the hand, even when you're out of position. Now, if I select the in position player, you can see that most of his hands don't have great equity either, or expected value either, but on some he's got excellent expected value. As we progress through the hand, we expect to see the in position player's equity realization improve, and so his expected value will thus improve. If he's got ace king offsuit, he's got 113 expected value on a pot size of 100. Why so low when he's got top? Well, because of the big blinds actions is probably going to fold when he c-bets. If he doesn't c-bet, he's not building the pot. If he does c-bet, big blind will usually fold. So that's why we don't have great equities here. Now, uh, that's not quite the same for aces because aces are almost always going to win. Even if the big blind does have a good hand, the aces could easily stack him. That's why he's got much better equity realization and thus much better expected value. If we look at the equity for the in position player, you can see that there's a lot of green on here. He's he's the one with the uncapped range. The big blind has a capped range, so we can expect that the in position player's aces are going to have a lot of equity because it's got top pair, even these low suited ones here. And as we get further and further down the pocket pairs, with the exception of the sets, the equity gets less. Like with a pair of threes, he's only got 51% equity, which is noteworthy on an ace high flop that this pocket threes still have slightly over half equity. So let's progress through this hand. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the strategy tab. The action's on the big blind. He's checking 100% of the time for all intents and purposes. So this is a button. I'm going to click it. And now the action is on middle position. You can see that the vast majority of his actions are in the tan area here. He's only checking about 8% of the time. He's betting 25% of the pot 80% of the time. He's betting 67% of the pot 7% of the time. And he's betting 100% of the pot 6% of the time. So he's c-betting with about 92% frequency on this ace high dry static flop. Now let's look at this bottom bar down here. You can see now how the distribution of actions is color coded, with the largest by far being the 25% small, basically undersized c-bet. It's interesting that Range Trainer Pro has set this up so that 25% is your percentage of choice, is your bet size of choice for a c-bet, when it's going to be a small c-bet. On some other kind of flop textures, the 2/3 pot size bet will be predominant, and on still others, the 100% pot c-bet might be predominant. One thing that Range Trainer Pro doesn't have for bet sizes is overbets for your flop c-bet. But a conclusion that you can draw from that is that this is actually calling for some kind of overbet, like say 125%, 150%, 200%. If you want to explore that, the best thing to do, I would think, would be to go through your own solver like GTO Plus or PioSolver. There's further analysis that we can do. We can look at this range, and we know already that we're going to make a small c-bet. If we hit the equity tab for the in-position player, now that the big blind has checked, the equities will have changed a little bit, not too much in this case. An expected value has hardly changed at all. But because the big blind did not lead out, we have a very slightly different set of frequencies here, but not really much. Set of expected values, I'm sorry, not really much. Let's go back to strategy. And let's say that I want to go back to the big blind's action. I can hit this back button, and I'm back to the big blind's action. Just in case I wanted to check and see what should happen when he donks out for a small amount. You've got a lot of different frequencies here for the middle position's action, but as you'll note, when I hit square size proportional, they come up less frequently. I'm going to back it up again and go back to the big blind's action, and then have the big blind check like he should do pretty much every time. Okay, let's say that I'm finished here. Let's say that this was all I wanted to see. I don't want to go any further into this flop texture. I can go back. I can click this flop button here. You see how it forms a pointer cursor? I can click this flop button, and it takes me back to the flop finder, and I can go and set up another flop. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. I want to stay on that one. I just wanted to show you how that red button works. I'll back it up back to the big blinds action again. Now I'm going to show you that for the big blinds initial action post flop, I click on that button and nothing happens because we're already at the beginning. The same thing with that reset button. It doesn't do anything. We're already at the beginning. So I'm going to hit check again. And I got another thing to tell you about the expected value. I'm going to go ahead and click on the in position player's expected value. And we can see how his actions are given percentages here. But if I click on a hand, let's click on the King 7 suited here. You'll notice how it reads that our expected value is 7,191. Well, that's not really true. It's giving it to you in basis points, like in accounting or in financial management, instead of percentages. So this is actually 71.9, 79.8, 82.3. That's what these expected values are. They're just multiplied by 100 to give you the basis points. So I go back to strategy. And now that I'm back on strategy with the King 7 suited selected, you can see it highlighted here. You can see that each hand in King 7 suited is giving us its own percentage of the time that we should execute that action. Like for King of Spades, 7 of Spades, we're going to bet 25, 88% of the time. We're going to bet 67, about 12% of the time. And we're going to bet 100, never. You can break down these strategies and percentages of actions by individual hands as well as by combos. To get it by combos here, you mouse over it, you can see that it's for King 7 suited. It says bet 108, 8.23, bet 67, 13.82, and etc. An interesting thing to note here is that we have a few combos where the checking is actually a considerable part of the mixed strategy. For example, for kings, we're going to be checking 38.4% of the time. For king queen suited, we're checking about 32% of the time. Now, should we try to remember that? Should we try to memorize that? When on a flop that, for all intents and purposes, since we're c-betting small 80% of the time, should we try to remember that with kings we're going to check more and to try and trap? With king queen suited, we're going to check some. Let's take a look at that king queen suited and analyze it further. You can see that with the king and queen of clubs, for which we don't have a backdoor flush draw, we're betting 25%, about 85%, or 25% of the pot, about 85% of the time. On the other ones is where we have more checking range here. 41% for the diamonds, 36% for the spades, 41% for the clubs. Do we need to remember that? Well, it might occur to us to do that during play. Once we've reviewed it, we may have planted a seed in our brain that says, in this particular situation, we would want to check. But I think for all practical purposes, the conclusion to take from this, the takeaway from this, with 80% frequency, is just go ahead and c-bet that small amount. Small amount c-bet, after all, is still the majority player for these two combinations. So you shouldn't really try to execute a mixed strategy unless you're trying to exploit someone that you have a strong read on. And then the same principle goes for a lot of these other combos for which we have a small checking frequency or even a singularity, or even where checking is a dominated strategy and it's not there. In some cases, against some players, you would check because you're exploiting somebody who's way too aggressive. But for most cases, for most player types, you're going to just play this small C bet. So because the majority action here is 80% small C betting frequency, let's go ahead and have the middle position player C bet small. It thinks a little bit, and now the action, as we can see here, is on the big blind. You'll note that the big blind strategy has quite a few mixed strategies. Most of them are where he has hit this flop hard or has good draws. You'll note down here in the bottom right hand portion of this range, of this hand chart, there is a lot of brown here. And the reason why is because this part, these cards are more often for the big blind, and so he's going to take aggressive action. This, some of these cards hit this big blind, and he's going to have to take some kind of aggressive action in order to balance his range. I mean, obviously, with the set of deuces and the set of sevens, the two pairs, he's going to want to take aggressive action and build the pot. But for the most part, a lot of his actions are just where he's hit the flop a little bit. He's got some kind of a wheel draw. He's got something. He's got a piece, and he needs to have some kind of a check raising range to with some good bluffs that have some equity to balance out his top equity hands like the sets and two pairs. One thing that you can do with this action proportion bar is click on one of the colors. These are actually clickable. You can see where it has the mouse cursor is turned into a pointer. If you click on that, it blacks out everything else except for that action, in this case call. So this is his check call range here. If this is the way you like to study, then this is a good tool for you. It filters out the other colors and just gives you a pure set of shapes for you to look at. If you can think in visualizations in terms of shapes, this is useful. You can combine that with the square size proportional action to get an even better idea. And now look at what we have. We have the columns of deuces, sevens, and aces that have a lot of action, except for some where we have none because we have some, either there's some other action than a call or we're not even in the hand anymore. And then all the baby pairs are all here for checks. And this is just another tool to help us memorize our action in a situation like this one. If we don't want it to be blacked out like that anymore, we can just click it again and it restores it. I'm going to go ahead and click on one to analyze it. Click on Jack 8 suited, and you'll note that our calling frequency is only 37% and our folding frequency is 63%. So I've clicked on it, and now we can see how the different individual hands have different frequencies. With the Jack of clubs, 8 of clubs, we're always folding. We don't have any backdoor draws. With the Jack of hearts, 8 of hearts, we're calling sometimes, but usually folding. And with Jack of spades, 8 of spades, we're usually calling and sometimes folding. Another thing that we can learn from this scenario is note the check raise sizing. Raising 25% pot is never done for all intents and purposes. Raising 75% pot is being done 11% of the time. So on the times that we do check raise, we're going to check raise big. And that's a general principle in Texas Hold'em. We shouldn't check raise small. We're just giving an opponent an opportunity to see another card for cheap when we don't want to. Part of our check raising range should be bluffs, and so we want to get the folds. The majority, or I shouldn't say the majority, the biggest percentage of actions is fold at 47%, but we also call 42%. So we're actually defending against that C bet a little bit more than half the time. So because I don't want to end the discussion here, I'm not going to hit fold. I'm going to go ahead and hit call for the big blinds action, and it'll take us to the turn. You can see here that we don't have a strategy yet because right now we're at a stage where it's the dealer's turn, and the dealer is going to turn a card. Let's go ahead and turn a 10 of spades. We get another shorter fair use delay. Actually, the fair use delay that you get right after you select a flop is about 20 seconds or so, maybe almost 20 seconds. For the turn card, the fair use delay is about 5 seconds. Race Trainer Pro feels that that's a good enough fair use delay to keep people from using this for real-time assistance. So now the action is on the big blind. You'll notice we have a vast majority still of checks. Only a few of these hands are we executing a reversal, and these are our big ones, like set of sevens, two pair, open-ended straight draw, etc. But do we need to memorize that? We can find out by hitting square size proportional, and you'll notice that those powerhouse hands that we would have check raised on the flop are not really here anymore. So there's not really something that we need to concern ourselves with. What we concern ourselves with is where we have the larger yellow squares that represent a check. So we're checking just about everything. We're going to go ahead and uncheck square size proportional. And you can see that we're checking just about everything. So the takeaway here is we're not going to execute a reversal on a card that really didn't change the board all that much. Sure, there's a few combinations that did that change, but for the most part, it's not a seriously board changing card. There's no good reason for the big blind to execute a reversal, or in some cases, people call it a donk or a lead. We can look at our equities on the turn here. I'm going to go ahead and click equity. Out of position player is checked because the action's on him. And you can see that even for the smallest offsuit ace that is still in the hand, the out of position player has a decided equity advantage. So sometimes he'll be dominated, but he has an equity advantage that he should consider taking advantage of. We can see that draws are worse off now. We didn't have very many draws to begin with, but say we have 9-8 suited. It's 9-8 suited. An open-ended straight draw has only got 26% equity. It's got slightly better equity because of the flush draw on 9-8 of spades, but for that combo draw. But even with that combo draw, he's only got 37% equity. Also on that combo draw, you'll note, if I go to expected value on the 9-8 suited, even the 9 and 8 of spades only have 84, expected value of 84 on a pot size of 150. So it's not very good at all. That's because there's only one card to come. If there were two cards to come, it would be a lot better. So because we're on the turn, we only got one more card to come. You can see the effect that has. So now I'm going to go back to strategy. Even here on the turn, we can still use the back button. Let's say that instead of calling, the big blind check raised 110% of the pot. Check raised 138. Now look at middle position's actions. He's mostly calling. He's doing some folding of hands like these king hands, queen hands that did not connect at all with the flop. Some of these other hands here, these suited hands, they did have some small connection with the flop. He's going to try and see what he can get for them. Like say this 10-8 of spades, for example. 10-8 of spades is going to come along. 10-8 of hearts is going to normally come along because we've got some equity there. We got backdoor equity. Let's go ahead and have the middle position player call that check raise. Go ahead and hit the 10 of spades again for the turn card. Small fair use delay. And now you'll see that even though the big blind check raised, he's still now checking the turn 58% of the time. Why is that? Well, because the middle position player actually called that check raise instead of folding it, that's greatly strengthened the middle position player's range. The big blind should probably at this point give up on his bluffs unless something good happens on the river. So he's up against a stronger range than his now. Remember, it takes a stronger range to call than it does to bet. Now here's a good place to hit the square size proportional checkbox. There was a lot of yellow and brown on that board before, but when I hit the square size proportional checkbox, it's almost all gone. The only hands really that the big blind needs to be thinking about at this point are his strongest hands, which are usually still going to be let out again, and he'll be still doing some action with some of his draws. And which draws are those? I'm going to guess that it's going to be his spade draws, his flush draws. So let's go ahead and hit this 5-3 suited, which has not connected with a pair at all. It does have a wheel draw, but it's also got, in the case of the spades, it's got a flush draw. And actually, with that 5-3 suited, he's checking. The betting is happening mostly with the 5 and 3 of hearts, probably because it's got a straight flush. I mean, the straight flush draw is broken, but he's got some other draws here. So I'll uncheck that again, and we're going to try seeing what happens when I hit the refresh button. You'll note that it took us back to the beginning. It shows us the big blind's calling range pre-flop. Let's try a different situation now. I'm going to go ahead and click database. And let's go with a 80 big blind single raise pot cutoff versus the big blind. And let's go with a different flop. I'm going to select something that's loosely connected and two-tone. I'm going to go with the Queen of Spades, 10 of Hearts, 6 of Spades. Right there. And the fair use delay starts at 20 seconds again. I skipped it a little bit. And now the action is on the big blind. And we've got a flop that's a little bit more dynamic here. You'll note that the big blind's checking range is still 98%, 100% for all intents and purposes. There are a few singularities. Don't bother with them. A human being could never balance his range like that. We're mere mortals. So I'm going to go ahead and check. You'll note that the cutoff has many more selections for bet size, as indicated by his bet size proportion indicator, and by looking in the hand chart and seeing all the different multicolored selections for each combination. You can see that the cutoff is still raising, c-betting, 90% of the time. But you'll note that he's betting with 100% pots or overbets more often than he's betting 67% pot, although he's betting 67% pot a considerable amount of the time too. His most frequent action on this flop is still 41.7%, 42% of the time, but you'll notice that his strategies are much more mixed. If we look at the equity, we can see that the cutoff still has good equity on this range, but there's a large portion of his range that's not doing as well. It's because this flop hit the big blind a little bit better than when we saw the ace-high dry static flop. If we look at the out of position players' equities, we can see that there are a lot of mixed equities for the different combos in his range. That's to be expected on a two-tone flop like this. A lot of his hands are going to be flush draws. He's going to have a few straight draws here. So on his hands that are draws, especially flush draws, there's going to be a lot of mixed equities for someone with that range. For example, if we hover over the King 2 suited, 27.7% equity with King 2 suited. But if we click on that to examine the hand breakdown, his flush draw has 49% equity, and anything that goes into the pot is probably giving him correct odds to play. These other hands are all but trash. 23%, 19%, 19%. The 23%, the few percentage points there are based on the backdoor flush draw. However, if I click the EV tab, we can see that the King 2 of spades has expected value of 72 on a 100 coin flop. Returning to equity, if we look at King 2 of spades with the flush draw, we've got 49% of 100. But if we go back to the expected value of the King and 2 of spades, we have 72 out of 100 of pot size. So why is that? Well, that's because in later streets, if we do pick up equity on the turn and it actually wind up making our draw, we could very easily stack our opponent. Small percentage of times that we do get that far in the hand, we're going to get paid off big time, and that's why we've got more expected value. But it's still less than our pot size here. The big disadvantage, and the reason why we're not recovering so much of this pot, is because of the power of position. The out of position player is going to have poor equity realization. So even though we have a chance to stack our opponent, we usually won't. It's not going to be easy to stack our opponent when we're the one playing out of position. Our opponent gets to dictate pot size. Our opponent gets to dictate how far the hand goes. So it's going to be a really rare event. So basically what we're hoping for is to make our flush and hope that the opponent does not have us dominated with the ace-high flush. How does the in-position player's equity and expected value look on King 2 suited? I'm going to go ahead and click King 2 suited, and we can see that the King of spades, 2 of spades, has 105 expected value for the in-position player, even though he's on a flush draw. This is because he has more kings in his range, and also because he's playing in position. You can see how much equity the in-position player has across most of his range. This is because he's playing in position. He's basically got the bread and butter situation in poker where he's in position with a superior range. You'll note that his equity in King 2 suited, even though he hasn't made a hand yet, is already at 57%. This is the bread and butter situation. Going back to expected value, we'll see that even though he has 105 expected value on a pot size of 100, because some of that extra is what he can expect to gain on future streets, it's not really that much more than the pot size here on the flop. And the reason for that is because we're strongly blocking the flush draws that the big blind could have here. So the big blind is likely going to fold if we give him any more action. He's not going to pay us off much. Even though he's got some draws here, we're strongly blocking the flush draws, and so it's not as connected and wet as it looks for him because of those blocked flush draws. Let's go back to the strategy tab, and we'll note that with the action on the cutoff, we'll notice the parts of the range that favor the overbets. These are hands that need to charge the big blind for missing his draws and thus gaining value, but that they also benefit from equity protection. Let's click Queen 10 suited. You'll notice that we don't have a flush draw. Queen of diamonds, 10 of diamonds, queen of clubs, 10 of clubs. So our hand is very unlikely to improve. In the meantime, the big blind has a number of potential draws. We need to charge the big blind for missing those draws. If he has no lucrative combo draws, big blind is unlikely to continue in the hand regardless of the bet size. Let's check this theory. I'm going to go ahead and click this 100% pot bet, and we'll see what happens. The action is now on the back of the big blind, and look at what he's got. He's folding 62% of the time. He's raising with hands at the very top of his range, like ace queen, which gives him top, two pairs, 10-6, a two pair, queen 10, the two pair, set. Second pairs that the big blind continues with are all flush draws. He always continues with top pair, and he continues with his best second pairs, like, say, the ace and 10 of spades, or the ace and 10 suited, I'm sorry, ace 10 off. He's continuing with his best second pairs, but as his second pairs go down, he's continuing with less and less. He needs some kind of other equity to add to it. It could be something like a flush draw with a pair needing improvement, you could call it. So, like, for example, with the 10-2 suited, with the 10 and 2 of spades, he's staying in the hand, but for these other ones, he's only staying in the hand about half the time. With the clubs and with just a top pair with no kicker, he's only staying about half and half. So with the second pairs, he's got to do a mixed strategy. With his second pair with the best kickers, he's staying in the hand though. With the action on the big blind, I'm going to go ahead and click the expected value tab here. You'll note that the pot size is 200. And let's go ahead and click the in position expected value. You'll note that with pocket aces, the in position players expected value is about 225. Remember that. Pot size 200, expected value 225 when he check raised. So now let's back up. Remembering we got 225 for expected value because of our overbet. Let's back up and let's instead make the cutoffs action a 25% pot c-bet. Now let's check the expected value. So we have to go back to the in position radio button. I mouse over the pocket aces, and now he's got an expected value of 150 on a pot size of 125. So we can see that the overbet had more expected value for the in position player here than the undersized c-bet on a hand like that. A lot of his best hands have reduced equity because of that small bet. Let's look at King Jack suited, for example. King Jack suited has expected value of 123 here. Let's back up and see what his expected value with the oversized bet is going to be. So I'm going to back up. I hit the overbet. Go back to in position. Go back to King Jack suited. and now he's at 198. So on his strongest hands, he needs to bet more money, even an overbet. That's the takeaway from here. The moral of this story is when the preflop raiser with the range advantage has a strong value hand, but on a dynamic flop, c-bet big more often with strong value hands and big draws.
Let's have a look at a 3-bet flop. I'm going to click the database button. It's going to take me to my database. I'm going to go with 30 big blind 3-bet button versus MP2 database right here. I'm going to remove any filters. Okay, I don't have any filters. Let me just eliminate what I had before. Let's do an analysis of the MP2 responding to a button 3-bet on a king high 2-tone unpaired connected flop. So I want it to be king high, so I'm going to click on king and filter it for kings. Then I'm going to go with 2-tone to filter it just for 2 tones. And I want unpaired connected flops. Let's go ahead and select king of clubs, 10 of diamonds, 8 of clubs. That is this one right here. And we get the fair use delay. And we'll note that the action is on MP2. The strategy board over here on the right only gives us the responses to MP2 when he raise called the 3-bet pre-flop. So these are the only hands that are left. And you can see, based on the frequency board down here and the hand and the action selection board, that for all intents and purposes, MP2 is checking all the time. He was the pre-flop 3-bet flatter, so on a flop like this, he's going to check all the time. And in fact, on most flops, he's going to check all the time. He's rarely going to donk. You'll note that there is a donking range if MP2 flatted with aces as a trap pre-flop. So let's take a quick look at that and see why. Okay, we can see that all of his paired aces with a club in them are checks, and the only ones that he's donking with are when he's not blocking the flush draw. And he's only donking with them half the time, so it's pretty obvious that whether he donks or checks is the same. The lesson we can take from that is, number one, that we can just go ahead and check all the time. It does bring up an interesting idea about how we can take some aggressive action if we're unblocking a draw. But for all intents and purposes, and on this board, we're going to check 100% of the time. And let's take a look at another thing here. I'm going to hit square size proportional, and you can see that having aces in this spot to begin with is a singularity. We don't really have to worry about it. We don't have to study it. Just we can maybe make a mental note how it's further proof that unblocking a flush draw is a good hand. But other than that, we really don't have a donking range at all on this flop when we flatted a 3-bet, we're out of position. So let's go ahead and hit check. And we see now that the action is on the button. Note how the button has an 80% c-bet frequency after he 3-bet pre-flop. We know that he's got an 80% frequency because he's only checking 20% of the time. The most frequent action now is to c-bet small. We can see that with 60%. And there's also a 5% frequency on 67% pot and a 14% frequency on a 141% pot. Remember, this is a 30 big blind effective stack, 3-bet flop or pre-flop. So any kind of a raise at this stage of the hand is going to be a jam more than likely. And when we see something like 141% of the pot, we know that that's a jam in here. I'm going to go ahead and select that overbet. And we can see that MP2 has the action now, and his only choices are to call or fold. That's another indication to us that the button's last action was to jam. You can't raise a jam, so we can see that. So let's back up a little bit. I'm going to hit this back arrow and hit it again to return to the MP2's action after the flop. Let's return to the button's action after the MP2 check. I hit back up. The action is on the button, and we have our choices. I'm going to go ahead and click the small C bet, which is the most frequent item here. And now the action is on MP2. MP2's continuing range is 69%, as indicated by the 31% folding frequency. He does have a small check raising frequency. It's mostly on his top pair hands and nutty flush draws and combo draws. I'm going to go ahead and click the big raise 141 button. And now we've check raised. The action is back on the button, and he can only call or fold because the MP2 check raise size was a jam. We have to confirm an action is a jam either by looking at that bet size and frequency size, which will be off. It won't be some even multiple of 10% or 5% or whatever. Or we can do what we did here and see that the other player's action is now just a call or a fold. Let's take a look at one of the nice features of the Range Trainer Pro Postflop Tool. It's random flops. We could save a lot of time and get a lot of studying done if we select random flops. Random flops skip the fair use delay, but it's not practical for use in an online poker game live where you are trying to use it for RTA, because you can't select any flop you want. You have to go with what the random flop selector gives you. This is a really nice feature. You can use it on your smartphone. You can, if you're spending 15 minutes waiting in the parking lot for your significant other to pick up groceries, you can sit there and study flops as long as you don't mind just having random flops thrown at you by the tool. So to use random flops, I'm going to hit the database button. It's going to bring me to the database selection screen. And let's click on 80 big blind, single raise, cut off first big blind. Takes us to the flop finder. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of the king. I'm going to go to Annie, and it'll select from all the flops. So I'm going to click the no delay mode switch here. You note how it deleted the card selections up on top, but it left us with the filters. We can still filter, but there are limits. You cannot filter it down below 20 flops. So I'm going to go ahead and filter this selection, because right now, let's say I don't want to have just any kind of flop thrown at me. I want to filter for a specific kind of flop. So let's say I want to drill and study just a certain kind of flop. I'm going to click the left high radio button because I want to look at high card flops. And then let's go with the center high card button. And now we have all the flops in the database that are purely high cards. Once I hit the high button over here. Now I'm going to click the monotone radio button. And look at what we have here. There's no delay mode. It must have 20 or more flops to randomize. So if you filter it down too much, you can't use this mode. That way you can't study a particular situation that you might be playing with. You have to have at least 20 flops so that you can't feasibly use it during online play as an RTA. So I'm going to go back and we're going to go with any suit selection here. And now I'm going to click select random flop. It thinks about it a little bit, but you'll note that we did not have a fair use delay. It went right to one of the flops that we configured for us to be studying. We can study this flop to our heart's content, go through all the streets, everything. We just can't select and be too picky about what flops we want. It keeps us from doing that. Let's say I don't like this one. Let's say I want to look at something else. I can go ahead and click this red flop button. It takes us back to the flop finder. I can have it select another random flop. Okay, this time it went to a royal flush draw. If we decide we want to study a different kind of flop texture, we don't have to hit this. We can hit the database button and it takes us back to the database selector. So I'm going to go ahead and select button versus MP2 under 30 big blind, single raise pot, like we had before. And now it takes us to the flop finder. We can then filter it as we want, or we can select a random flop right from here. I'm going to go ahead and select a random flop from our last filter that we had, but this time with a different scenario. And now we're in 30 big blinds, MP2. And if we look at the actions up here, MP2 raised, button called, and it gave us this flop.
This concludes part 1 of the post-flop videos. I'll see you in part 2.